Today at the National Press Club, Shadow Treasurer Tim Wilson. The federal member for Goldstein will outline the opposition's vision for what it calls a fairer, freer and better Australia for all. Tim Wilson with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. My name's Tom Connell, I'm the club's president and also anchor at Sky News Australia. We have had a tradition now for 52 budgets for a post-budget address by the Treasurer and the Shadow Treasurer as well. So we thank Tim Wilson for keeping up that tradition. He is, of course, entering a fairly fraught political debate. I think it's fair to say, though, Tim's never been too shy of being in a debate. Perhaps that's even an understatement. My first experience with Tim was when he was part of the Institute of Public Affairs. It was a symbiotic relationship because at Sky News we always needed panellists and Tim was always willing to drive into the studio at pretty short notice. One of his more noteworthy comments, of course, was talking about abolishing the Human Rights Commission. And his next job was Human Rights Commissioner, so he was able to pivot there quite neatly. And then it was into politics in 2016. You might call this a period of winning for Tim. He won pre-selection for Goldstein, he won the seat of Goldstein, and depending on who you talk to, he maybe single-handedly won the 2019 election via franking credits. Then perhaps a little bit of a reality check politically. There was 2022 losing his seat and of course losing government, but never afraid of debates and taking up the cudgels again. He was the only MP to win back a so-called teal or independent seat. So that's Tim's political background. I remind our members the club will have a podcast of this address on our website later today. Please join me to welcome the Shadow Treasurer, Tim Wilson.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for that incredibly kind introduction. But I am going to you've given me an opportunity to dispel an urban legend. I have never actually called for the abolition of the Human Rights Commission. It's a lie that's repeated ongoingly, and unfortunately, it gives me an opportunity to clarify it today. But thank you nonetheless, because it's wonderful to be here, and thank you to our sponsor, Westpac, and of course to all of my parliamentary colleagues, Senators Ruston, Bragg, Askew, Collins, particularly to my Shadow Finance Minister colleague, Senator Claire Chandler, Aaron Fioli, and ACT Leader of the Opposition, Mark Parton. I also want to acknowledge, let's call him the spirit animal of small business for so many Australians, former Small Business Minister Bruce Bilson, who's also here today. It's wonderful to see you, Bruce. Last Tuesday night, Australia was hit with an economic earthquake, and its epicentre was Canberra. There were warnings in the weeks prior, but many Australians didn't believe the tremors would reverberate out to them. And following Tuesday, they have been hit by aftershocks that have struck at their very confidence. The government would have you believe this budget was all necessary for intergenerational fairness, and that the yearning for young Australians to get ahead is denied by their grandparents. The reason the aftershocks are still felt is because this budget goes beyond bank accounts and targets the pride so many Australians have in their work and the spirit of the nation itself. This budget pulled away the one thing young Australians need more than ever: to get their first foothold on the ladder of opportunity so that they can work in the belief of a better tomorrow. No budget has ever targeted every generation of Australians, from those who are renting for their first time out of home, through to those in the last home of aged care. It has presented us with a choice. Are we still the nation of the fair go, where Australians have a future built on aspiration, cooperation and shared nationhood? Or will we accept a future of managed decline, dependence and division? Do we want to grow together or grow apart? Turn to each other or against each other? Are we a nation of self-starters, or will we accept an economy and society to build on seeking permission? Since Tuesday, my phone, email and social media feeds have been in meltdown. Messages have started with, quote, "Both my parents died before I turned 20 years old. They left me with nothing to give me a start." And now this budget killed the aspirations of my children and the children of many, many parents similar to me. Others that said, for the past 2 years, I have operated without taking a wage just to keep the doors open. And the new tax changes will make this impossible. But the most common theme is Australians feeling their government has turned their back on them and asking whether they should turn their back on Australia for another country. But the stories that have stood out most are those of lost hope. One that stood out was Sienna. At the age of 12, Sienna set up tweenie skin in her bedroom. In her own words, it was built after school, she packed orders on weekends and reinvested basically every dollar back into the business. She is now 17 and her business is growing. I love Sienna's story. Plucky, determined, ambitious, craving her own path. A young Australian who believes that with optimism, imagination, work and enthusiasm, she can shape her future. It's a stab at commerce, but it is a mindset about creating our own destiny. Yet while Sienna finishes her HSC, she has learned she has a shareholder who wants to take half the reward for her effort. There are hundreds of thousands of Siennas all across our country. Men and women who believe that we are, in the words of Henley, the master of my life and the captain of my soul. They aren't interested in politics. Or should I say, they haven't been. Because in the last week they have roared with thousands of posts critiquing what they are calling their new unwelcome business partner. A truly organic moment, so spontaneous. And I'm sure you've read the stories. Tanning shops and beauticians, tradie workwear businesses, flooring specialists, caterers, wielding fabricators, canvas swag makers, chiropractic clinics, plumbers, community gyms, seafood markets and irrigation bore specialists. A kaleidoscope of this country of the thousands, hundreds of thousands of Australians who normally punch the sky but now feel their government is punching them. They don't want thanks, nor do they want support. They only desire that their hard work is paid off and respected. One salon operator wrote, "You build it from nothing. You work late nights, early mornings, survive interest rates, pay wages, rent, stock, super, GST, tax, answer client messages at 11 p.m, squeeze in emergencies, miss weekends, and somehow your silent investor, the Prime Minister, still clocks in for 47% without ever stepping foot behind the chair." The innovators, disruptors, risk-takers and builders of this country have worked out this Prime Minister. He's the guy in that group assignment that does none of the work but still wants the grade. Budgets matter. Budgets matter because they are more than an economic or financial statement. They are a map of a government's priorities and their character. A lot of people are talking about this budget as broken trust, but it is an abuse of trust by the Prime Minister. Where we should have got unity, we had the Prime Minister stoking fights around kitchen tables of the nation, pitting children against their parents, grandchildren against their grandparents. And where we should have got a path for growth, we got the politics of redistribution and resentment. And the Teal MPs cheering from the sidelines for the Prime Minister's betrayal, confirming the ruse of their commitment to integrity. It is a budget so absent of ambition for our nation that its failure is shown up in its own numbers. Public spending will outstrip private sector growth. Private investment is barely moving, and new mining investment growth is projected to fall to zero in 2 financial years' time. Labor's own budget forecasts show declines with GDP growth at 1.75% and the RBA projecting only 1.4%. Where we should have got prudence, we got $1.25 trillion in debt by the end of the decade and $40 billion a year, or $80,000 a minute, in interest. That's equivalent to 12 additional credit cards being issued per Australian behind their back. For small businesses, the situation is particularly dire. They are already living with record insolvencies. 8 close every business hour, and is reflected in consumer confidence and small business confidence data, which was weak before Iran and has now collapsed in NAB, ANZ and Westpac surveys. The only way the government can continue to claim growth is by overshooting their migration target. In this budget, the government has revealed it is a freeloader off the hard work of Australians and that they don't understand the engine of the economy and the people who power it every day. We now have countless examples flooding through our Not the Tax We Voted For website at www.notthethax.com.au that demonstrate the government simply does not understand how Australia's economy works. That the problem of the nexus between tax rates didn't mean capital gains tax was too low, it's that income tax punishes work. That negative gearing is a legalistic way of not taxing losses, and when you do, rents go up, just like when Paul Keating scrapped it. And with young Australians investing in shares, ETFs and crypto for their first home deposit, they're on the capital gains hit list too. As are the rentvestors who hope to buy property where they can while they rent where they choose. And they admit in their own budget these taxes will lead to 35,000 fewer homes being built, pushing home ownership further away for some. They also don't understand the role that trusts play to protect small businesses and family businesses, and protect child support payments and even protect incomes for victims of domestic violence. The government could have gone after the $15 billion rorted by the CFMEU Labor cartel, but they targeted the self-employed instead. The government could have targeted those who are fleecing over $6 billion in tobacco tax, but they hit small businesses instead. This is a government that protects those who hurt Australians and hurt those who work hard. And we know the Treasurer is the inflation arsonist that cosplay as the firefighter. He says he has the habit under control, but he keeps reaching for the fiscal jerry can, pouring more debt petrol on the inflation fire every day. Australians are now living the consequences of the government's active inflation agenda 3 times over, declining living standards with higher taxes and interest rates. Because of Labor's rampant inflation, Australians' real wages have fallen by 3% since the start of the Albanese government and are still falling. That's why, over their time, the Albanese government is the highest taxing government in Australian history, and why personal income taxes in particular are at the highest level as a share of the economy ever. And we know that taxes on Australians are going to rise. The Prime Minister seemed to concede the other day that he has plans to gather an additional $200 billion in income taxes alone. And for all the talk of tax cuts, the income tax cuts they took to the last election were wiped out by inflation, by bracket creep in 6 months, as this round will be by Christmas. And where inflation goes, interest rates follow, with 15 rate rises under Labor. An average couple with an average mortgage has lost $32,000 a year in real purchasing power. The reason Australians feel they are going backwards is because they are. And the Treasurer has lost control of the economy, which is why fiscal policy is going in one direction and the Reserve Bank is headed in the other. The Treasurer is now playing a game of interest rate chicken with the Reserve Bank Governor and daring her to hike rates again. Inflation is not a bug. It is a design feature of the economy Labor built, a deliberate cycle to fuel the inflation, tax the inflation and spend the inflation. Wash, rinse, repeat. Shortly after becoming Federal Treasurer, Jim Chalmers penned an essay arguing, "Our mission is to redefine and reform the economy and institutions in a way that makes communities resilient." 4 years on now, we know who they govern for, and it is themselves and their fellow travellers of organised labour, lawyers, super funds and big business interests. In doing so, Labor expands their control and the growth of institutions that sit between Australians and their own aspirations. For the community, this might have been a bad faith budget, but is a good faith budget for those in Labor's ecosystem. Since 2022, they've reversed the legacy of the 1980s on industrial relations and whose growth sectors are public sector jobs, class action lawsuits and regulatory compliance. And in too many areas, including the NDIS, they have opened the gates to fraud, corruption and organised crime so that the taxes honest Australians pay have been harvested by dishonest interests. And when a government corrodes the private economy, it undermines the pathway for opportunity and our spiritual confidence in ourselves. Growth outstripped by inflation can only lead to resentment, when there will be cynics that will take advantage and seek to lead others into the orange paddock of despair. Labor cannot fix this mess because the problems flow from their economic model to recreate the Australian economy to feed their interests aligned to them and not to Australians. The 5 key drivers of productivity show it very clearly. On tax, Labor have revealed that they are putting political survival today ahead of the investment needed to build a more hopeful tomorrow. On skills, they'd rather Australians go through a unionised system than open pathways for people to learn on the job and meet market demand. On technology, they're Luddites who resist integration if it risks displacing their party loyalists, even if their competitiveness of the Australian economy is put at jeopardy. On energy, they would rather give tax breaks to foreign investors in intermittent energy sources to save political face, rather than build the energy systems Australians need to restore our country's resilience and its competitiveness. On regulation, they might hold roundtables, but they refuse to confront that the biggest growth in productivity-killing regulation is in the public sector, so that red tape reduction would mean, ultimately, fewer bureaucrats. Every regulation written by someone on a salary lands on someone trying to make payroll. And their only answer to Australia's housing crisis now seems to be Liberal policy they previously rejected and to make Australia a permanent nation of renters. And while mums and dads are losing, international investors and super funds keep preferential arrangements for corporate rentals. We fundamentally reject Labor's vision in favour of renting for life. Home ownership is not just about the bricks and mortar, but is the spiritual centre for families, the North Star of our aspiration and the economic security for tomorrow, and central to the democratic ownership of our very common wealth. Labor's economic model digs us into a hole, and they are intent on continuing to dig. And the real risk is they're setting Australia's economy up for failure for the future. Recent reports from the E61 Institute found Australia has experienced a long-term decline of the self-employed and small business. Yet they are also the ones that disproportionately hire employees in comparison to their size and are the most innovative and productive. Concurrently, the Australian Institute of Company Directors has reported regulatory compliance is basically the fastest growing sector of the economy and is sapping out the dynamism of everything it touches. That matters because Anthropic's analysis into labour market disruption in an AI-driven economy predicts the jobs most exposed to displacement are those in public and corporate bureaucracies. Labor is creating a sit-down economy that is at risk of technological failure, rather than the stand-up economy that channels people's potential. As former economic advisor to the Albanese government, Alexander Sanchez has outlined, by almost any meaningful measure, The open economy that replaced the old Australian settlement is now being quietly, steadily dismantled, not by ideological flourish, but by stealth. A frog slowly being boiled. Though Tuesday night's budget perhaps challenges that thesis. They're turning up the heat. This future is not inevitable, but we must choose a different path. A Liberal vision for Australia's economy is one where the policy levers of the nation work in favour of Australia's energy and its aspiration. And that starts with a Liberal approach to intergenerational fairness. Peter Costello was fond of saying the best youth policy was leaving young Australians with no Commonwealth debt. It is because it unshackles them from the decisions of the past and forges their future. It means that they can set their eyes to the horizon with opportunity that is open. And intergenerational fairness starts with young Australians being able to build wealth to get ahead. Our message to those targeted by this budget is simple. The self-starters are what built this country, and we are going to back you in to be its future. You work, you risk, you should get ahead. And that is why the Coalition is being explicit. We will oppose the higher taxes the government has put forward and we will repeal them if necessary. Opposing Labor is not enough. That is why last Thursday night the Leader of the Opposition, Angus Taylor, committed to indexing income tax thresholds to address bracket creep. And under our changes, young Australians will keep what they earn, not have it taxed by stealth. Nor do we want the next generation of Australians to be pushed into being a PAYG employee. We want an economy of choice, not of conformity. The disruption of AI raises the prospect of more Australians joining the ranks of the self-starting, self-employed and small businesses of this nation. So we are going to increase the instant asset write-off to $50,000 a year and make it permanent. But that is not enough. Where the Albanese government has declared war on the self-starters and small businesses of Australia, we are going to fight for them. In generations past, young Australians got ahead by buying property. Today, young Australians know that to get ahead, they need to invest, they need to build a business, a side hustle, equity or a start-up. For too long, Australia's laws have been designed around the influence of those who can hire lobbyists to walk the Prime Minister's corridor. Under Labor's model, you pay to play, and when you do, the rules are written for you while small business is shut out. But the cost and compliance is the same for small businesses that are focused on getting ahead and lack human resources, legal, tax and industrial relations departments. Over the past year, I have been speaking with small businesses and the self-starters across this great country, and particularly about how the rules of the economy increasingly feel rigged against them. And I have reached a simple conclusion. We have an economy designed for the 20th century, and I am no longer convinced tinkering at the margins will always fix it. We need new economic structures to empower people for the 21st century. So today I'm formally launching the Stand with Small campaign to back the self-starters of our nation and to get their input about how our economy needs to be restructured to empower them. The Coalition Government will consult on a Small Business Act, and we are proposing at least 4 pillars. A single definition, that all Commonwealth law will refer to one definition of a small business. A right to be paid, because cash flow is king, and we will have a legal maximum payment term to small business from government and big business. A right to be heard, and this is particularly appropriate right now. As appropriate, each new law should require a small business regulatory impact statement, and there should be pathways for feedback so small business voices can be heard from the Reserve Bank, ASIC, the ATO and Fair Work. A right to bid, a new and expanded minimum requirement for government procurement that must come from small business. We have put forward a framework. We want the self-starters of the nation to tell us what the details should be and what should also be included. So to have your say, go to www.standwithsmall.org. And over the remainder of the year, with the Shadow Minister for Small Business, Senator Jacinta Price, and all my colleagues, we will be holding consultations all around the nation. So it does not matter whether you're in Albany, Adelaide, Ascot Vale or Aspley. If you're a self-starter, the rules will back your success, and we want to hear from you. We will replace Labor's pessimism with Liberal optimism, a nation where the taxpayers are respected, hard work pays off, and Australians feel in control of their lives. Australians know this budget is a dud. And after this budget earthquake, there will be a substantial clean-up job. But it is not a time for despair. We need courage to fight for a new dawn, a dawn that restores living standards and protects our way of life, a dawn that fills young Australians with hope, aspiration and confidence, a dawn that puts trust in Australians and aligns their incentives to get ahead to the advancement of us all, to build an economy that favours the Australian people rather than Labor, big union and big super fund oligarchs, and not an economy that is empowered to kick the lemonade, a government that is empowered to kick the lemonade stands of the next generation. And that's why we will repeal Labor's new taxes that will otherwise kneecap the aspiration of young Australians to get ahead. Because a country that punishes risk eventually runs out of courage. Project Australia has always been about building a better present to hand an inheritance to the next generation. This is our time for choosing. Continue on Labor's path of spending inflation and debt to feed an economy built for them, or we can reclaim the soul of our country, its possibility and its promise. We can renew our fighting spirit, a nation of self-starters where we aspire, innovate, invest in the future and look to the horizon with confidence, living out the spirit of the boxing kangaroo. Thank you.
Thank you, Shadow Treasurer. So obviously you've made it pretty clear what you think of Labor's solution. I wonder what you think of the problem they've put up, and I'll frame it in this way. So $100,000, if it's wages you pay $23,000 in tax, family trust $13,000, capital gains $6,500, superannuation $0. I know you have bracket creep, but that essentially makes the problem not get any worse. Do you see that current breakdown as imbalanced?
Well, the government likes to spin lines on all of their different numbers to present their particular narrative, and I fully respect the right to be able to do so. But at the end of the day, the focus has to be how are we going to back people to work and to put people, labour and capital to work. That's how you grow the economy. It is not by seeking to punish different sections of the community and try and punish the pathways for them to get ahead. So they see it as a pathway where they think they're able to tinker and correct the balance rather than actually what's going to mobilise people and get them to move forward. So I reject the promotion and the approach that they're taking. You know, I wrote, I think this is quite amusing actually, Tom. I once spoke at the National Press Club in 2014 when I was Human Rights Commissioner. I actually asked to come and speak at the Press Club when I was last in office and was denied. And I was told the reason, and the topic was intergenerational fairness and housing and home ownership. And I was told nobody was interested in that topic. Because the pathway for young Australians to get ahead is not punitive, it is focused on how we create opportunity for the future. We know that income tax is a direct punishment. The only answer the government then has is to turn around and say, well, we'll increase taxes on everything else. How about they look at how they reward Australians of whatever age and whatever stage of their life so that they might actually put more effort in and get ahead. Instead, their only answer is to punish that. It does not solve the problem. It just seeks to create a political narrative to justify why Canberra should be empowered against Australians.
I'll have to see that line where you were told nobody was interested, because I'd be surprised if that were it. Anyway, I'm going to stick to my one question and be disciplined and see if my colleagues can follow suit. Jacob Steinman from AAP.
Thanks, Mr Wilson. So you've promised to repeal Labor's tax changes, which are forecast to bring in an extra $77 billion in revenue over the decade. On top of that, you've got another $35 billion in foregone revenue over 4 years with indexing bracket creep. You've promised more defence spending. Can you identify which spending areas you'll find the savings in to bring the budget back to balance? And can you guarantee, if you do form government next election, that you will bring the budget back to balance before 34-35, which is a current estimate?
What I said in my speech is that there's going to be one hell of a clean-up job after this government. We don't have very much confidence in their current spending and their current budget. There seems to be taxes that they haven't disclosed. The Prime Minister is even flagging additional increases in income tax that weren't within this budget. So it's impossible to say with any confidence about where we're going to be in 2 years' time. But I can tell you that our focus will always be on how we make sure that we get the budget to a sustainable position, and particularly because our long-term objective is to make sure that we pay off debt, because we cannot continue to hand to future generations the burden of the responsibility for today. We need to be mindful of the fact that young Australians need to be able to get ahead.
Next question, Phil Curry from the AFR.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Mr Wilson. Just quick question. Should you be the Treasurer after the next election or whenever, would you reinstitute the tax to GDP ratio, the 23.9, I think it was, that the Coalition had previously?
We haven't made that announcement, Phil, but we have made a commitment towards a Charter of Budget Honesty, because we understand that, going to the point of the question that I was just asked before, we're faced with a situation where the budget seems to be crumbling. This budget seems to be crumbling before the eyes of the Australian people. But in addition to that, we don't know what's going to be potentially in the next 2 budgets ahead. What we need is clarity and to understand the state of the finances, because we know from what's been in what I call the shadow budget, but essentially off-budget measures, they're growing at a rapid rate as well. So we are absolutely going to be focused on what it is we need to do. We are constrained by what it is we are going to inherit, but the clearest way to do that is through transparency and honesty, because that will be the basis at least you can make informed policy decisions. That is not what we have currently.
Thanks.
So that would make sense, but it's how quickly you could bring it back down. Is that what you're alluding to?
Well, it's understanding the state of the finances where they are. We set, a test around making sure that there was honest government at the core of this budget. We have had a consistent problem where that has not been revealed. We don't even know what they're actually going to end up being legislated. It's clear from when looking through the budget papers, the government didn't even understand the implications CGT on capital gains for the venture capital sector. They added a footnote at the last minute they were going to go through a consultation process. We just don't have the clarity that we would like. It's not to avoid it, it's because those are the budget papers that we have in front of us now.
Dana Daniel from the Canberra Times.
Thank you for your speech. Dana Daniel from the Canberra Times. There are definitely more public servants than lemonade stands in Canberra. You've said that Labor's growth sector is public sector jobs and that red tape reductions will mean fewer bureaucrats, but you haven't said how many APS jobs the Coalition would cut. The budget papers show that Labor has added almost 45,000 public servants since winning power, bringing the average staffing level to 217,000. So would you cut 45,000 roles? If not, how many? And are you avoiding talking about this because the Liberal Party's election review found that it was damaging?
I haven't avoided talking about it. We'll wait and see where we're going to be in 2 years' time. The government has made a series of announcements in the lead up to this budget claiming that they're going to have voluntary redundancies in the public sector, but when we've looked at the budget papers, it's turned around and said that all of their measures around deregulation involve employing more public servants.
A lot of those roles are in defence, though, and there are redundancies. So Labor says the public service is about the right size. Your leader says that he doesn't want it to grow too much. So is it just that you don't want it to grow anymore, or does it need to be smaller?
I want a public service that meets the needs of the Australian people and to make sure that government does what is appropriate within its responsibilities.
But is it currently too big?
If we get down onto a single number, then we'll debate the individual number. The reality is we need government that's focused on how it's orientated, because I've talked specifically about some of the challenges with technology that is coming and where that might enable the public sector to be more productive. I absolutely believe in having an efficient government that makes sure it uses taxpayers' money appropriately and minimises the spend so that we can either reallocate spending to maximise the services Australians need, or of course to minimise the financial pressure on Australians. But how we balance that out constantly changes based on the changing need and the times. As you rightly outlined, it was only a few years ago that the focus on defence was not such a prominent feature in the national conversation. The fact that we now live in the most dangerous time since the Second World War means that we need to rebalance that part of it. We need a government that meets the needs of the Australian people at the time at which we are in a position to form government.
David Spears from the ABC.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Tim Wilson, for your address. The government says there's a whole lot of misinformation around its capital gains tax changes. I wonder if I could ask you to explain the example you just used in your speech. You talked about Sienna, who started 20 Skin 5 years ago, done well, business has grown. You said half of her profits will be taken by the silent shareholder, the Prime Minister. Can you just explain how that would happen? The government says existing exemptions for small business would remain. So how exactly would Sienna lose half her profit?
Well, it depends on when Sienna chooses to opt out of her business and sell it, and for what price. And she started from her bedroom. Her cost structures were zero. So, of course, she's going to have a maximum uplift associated with her businesses. A lot of the people who are setting up businesses are. The Treasurer's out there today spinning a message, as often he does, highlighting existing exemptions for CGT. Most of those are focused at the back end of people's lives, particularly as they head towards retirement, and also based on whether they're the price at which they sell. I can't tell you what Sienna's going to sell, but I can tell you that she is very concerned about, as many Australians are, that their hard work, saving and sacrifice and everything they have put into it could, depending on the exit strategy and price, ultimately face up to 47%.
But is it possible she could pay no capital gains tax as well?
Well, I can't give you, we're dealing with hypotheticals. I'm telling you what her story is. It depends on when she decides to exit. It depends on what she sells for. It depends on what stage of life she's at, based on the current application of the law. But there are a lot of small business owners all around the country that are looking at the proposals put in this budget, and not just do they think it comes and attacks them, they are looking at it and saying, we worked, we sacrificed, we saved, we were there at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning when nobody else was there, and all of a sudden the government, which traditionally takes some of the capital gain, no one's disputing that, is essentially working towards doubling that, and in some cases it would be that much.
Matthew Cranston from The Australian.
Last year I asked Angus Taylor how many people in Western Sydney know what bracket creep is. I'm going to ask you today, how many One Nation voters do you think know what bracket creep is? And it was quite noticeable in your 20-something minute speech, you barely mentioned it. This is meant to be like the main policy for the Libs, indexing thresholds. Why hardly any mention? Don't you have to sell that a bit better? Because Labor's Watto is politically very savvy in the sense that they can announce like a tax cut almost every year, but with indexation, it's one and done. So you've really, and there's all these questions about the cost of it as well. Like, how do you make the cost of it more flexible? Big questions around all that. Sorry for so many of them.
That's fine, Matt. I don't mind your questions at all. I mean, I talked specifically about how inflation was the silent tax on Australians' incomes, and whether people know the term bracket creep or not, they feel it in their hip pocket. Australians, when they go to the supermarket right now, know that they're getting less in their red basket than they got previously. When they look at what's happening with their mortgage repayments, they know it's going up in comparison to what they have done in the past. 15 interest rate rises over the life of this government is having a really serious impact on the stress that Australians are living, and I use that number of $32,000 reduced in purchasing power parity. And one of the challenges is bracket creep as well, where people are being pushed, even if they do get a wage increase, they're facing a situation where they don't feel the benefits of it. So we will absolutely continue to sell this policy all the way through to the next election, because we see it as very important, and to also educate the public along the way of what the government is doing. But you can't have a conversation about bracket creep without having a conversation and framing the scale of the problem of inflation, and particularly what the government is doing to stoke it. And the government likes to turn around left, right and centre and blame international events and international conflict for Australia's inflation crisis. It's simply not backed up by the hard data. The interest rate rise that happened earlier this year, not the most recent one, came off the back of the second half of last year. And that continues to be a persistent problem. And if we remove the Iran conflict tomorrow, Australia would still have an inflation problem. The government is at the heart of the problem Australians are experiencing, and until we understand that and address that, we will not fix the problem either of bracket creep or whether Australians get greater purchasing power for themselves.
Tom, I know this is against the rules, but just really quickly, you've got an investment trust as well. Do you know how much more tax you'll be paying?
I haven't bothered to calculate that. It's not really my primary focus.
So you mentioned the best thing for Australians would be no debt, which is a long way off. Even the initial target of balancing the budget, is that many years away, even if it were an Angus Taylor, Tim Wilson government, given the pledge as well on bracket creep?
Well, I'll go back to the point I made before. Firstly, I don't think the bracket creep measures need be the reason for any adjustment. I think the bigger challenge is going to be how we're going to grow the economy. At the moment, the whole conversation around the budget is how we're going to redistribute the resources of our country. But that's not a very hopeful, optimistic vision for the country that is built on something that young Australians are going to work towards. We actually need to talk about the point of rebalancing. We need a rebalancing back towards a growth trajectory which actually improves the living standards and prosperity of every Australian.
So it's growth rather than big spending cuts?
Well, it needs to be both. I mean, you need to cut spending, you need to make sure that you're also growing the economy, but the government has basically given up on growth. They are not interested, it's not their priority, and most of the budget measures they've introduced have been focused explicitly on redistribution. Australians will live a poorer standard of living if we do not do that, particularly and drive an agenda towards growth, particularly in the context that we continue to overshoot the government's own migration expectations. We have choices as a nation. Do we want to manage decline? That is the Labor vision. Or do we want to grow the economy, empower Australians, back small businesses to get ahead, and particularly for the self-starters to lean into the future? Because, yes, the world is uncertain, and none of us are under any illusion about that. Technological change, and I spoke about it in my speech, may be one of the most disruptive forces that we have. None of us know. But do we empower people and create the legal structures and the tax structures to back them in, to back Australians who are enterprising, confident, and look to the future with horizon? I can tell you that's where my focus is going to be.
Paul Sakal from the SMH and the Age.
Thanks, Tom. Shadow Treasurer, just a question on migration, which was another key theme of the opposition leader's budget reply last week. He and others in the party have started to use the term mass migration. You don't use the term, even when asked. Some of your other colleagues here, like Senator Bragg and others, also don't use it. I wonder why you don't use that term, given Australia's pace of demographic change has been among the highest in the OECD for decades and the highest on some measures. And just on the broader politics of migration, how do you think the party should balance its rhetoric, given it needs to reflect the concerns of a chunk of the community who have problems with the pace of demographic change, along with the need to win back a bunch of seats that have high Indian and Chinese-speaking populations?
Well, I fundamentally believe that we should have a migration program that works for Australia. That's the purpose of a migration program. It's not to suit the interests in particular of the migrants. It's how do we enrich and advance our national interests for all of us. And it needs, therefore, to be sustainable. It needs to be sustainable in a way based on the pathways for people to economically integrate, socially integrate, and that we can house new Australians. You're not going to do that if the number of people outpaces the capacity for us to absorb them and to house them. People have legitimate concerns about our country and whether we are able to continue to absorb the number of people who are coming here. We know the need to make sure that it's based on what advances our national interests and skills, particularly to do things, including partly the challenges around the skills we need to build new housing. So I think it's about getting the balance back into what advances our national interest. And we know that the government is overshooting even their own expectations around that. So I don't really see that it's that controversial a proposition. When it comes to the political balance, not every political party makes decisions so calculated as the Labor government does, where they're prepared to eat into the equity of our country to advance their political interests. You know, at the end of the day, I think this is one of the most immoral governments in Australian history. And one of the reasons I think that is because I think they've made a series of shrewd political decisions that advance their interests to the extent of the whole nation. And I don't think that's moral, I don't think that's right. And that's why I believe it should go.
Do you reject the term mass migration?
That's not a term I've said before that I use, but the focus is on, I've always looked at migration as how do we ensure that new Australians, or migrants, find a pathway to become new Australians, so they come, they commit and they contribute, because that is in their interests and it is in our interest too. And I can't imagine that any other Australian would think otherwise.
Next question, Andrew Green from the West Australian.
Tim, I'll address this question as not only the Shadow Treasurer, but probably the nominal leader of the moderate faction now in your party. And to follow up from Paul's question on migration, you are someone who managed to defeat a Teal, but your leader's comments have upset diaspora communities and on migration. As someone who has defeated a Teal, what's your advice to your party when talking about this issue of migration, and how can you win back some of those seats that were lost at the last election on migrants?
I think you're drawing a, how would I put it, I think you're drawing this sort of comparison which isn't justified. I said at the end of the question to Paul that I think the overwhelming majority, and I've yet to meet anybody really, who doesn't believe that Australia's migration program shouldn't advance our national interest. I genuinely have never met anybody that it should be based on what is sustainable, which provides pathways for people to economically, socially integrate, culturally integrate, and that includes their pathway for housing. Australians believe that, and I cannot believe that new Australians would want anything otherwise, because I don't see how you advance somebody's personal interest to achieve their dream, to live out the promise of this country, if they can't then go on and do things like secure a home. So I think of course, always when you're talking about people and their lives, you should do it with respect. And I'm not suggesting in any way, shape or form that hasn't been done. We just need to be realistic about the fact that Australians have a concern about where we are, our future trajectory, and again, going off by the government's own budget numbers, they say they're going to overshoot their targets. That doesn't fill Australians with confidence that the government understands how to manage Australia's migration program, nor that they always believe that it's working in our national interest. Sustainability involves multiple factors, and that includes migrant Australians looking at how they make sure they can realise their potential in this country too.
And a quick other one, Tony Abbott, would you welcome him back to federal politics, particularly in a Victorian seat?
Well, that's up to the voters of whichever seat that is, and whether they decide to do it. But I always want good candidates to be standing forward and putting themselves forward for success, but I don't seek to predetermine the will of voters or pre-selectors.
Charles Croucher from the Nine Network.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tim. The fundamental argument here seems to be a discussion of taxation of investment and risk versus taxation of labour. The average tax rate of a nurse is between 20 and 25%. Same with teachers. Coal miner or iron ore miner would probably double that.
Yep.
Are you fundamentally okay with someone selling an investment property or a business or shares or crypto and being taxed at a lower rate than a nurse or a teacher and half the rate of a coal miner?
Well, firstly, it depends on when they've purchased the asset, et cetera, et cetera. And remember, people buy assets with post-tax income. Like, this seems to be completely forgotten in a lot of the conversation. So inflation, and with the current government's active inflation agenda, is actively outstripping value, not just for people who earn incomes, but potentially with what they're going to do to the value of assets as well. So I absolutely want, and I've said this to Tom before, and I've said it in other fora, I believe that it is better to have lower income taxes because I think that's a pathway forward. If the answer to every single question is, well, this person's got this tax rate, so the conclusion, therefore, is we have to increase the tax rate on everything else, what you're saying is that the government has a natural right to people's wealth and what they've earned and what it is they've justly put their effort to. I'm sorry, that just is not my worldview. I fundamentally believe that we should encourage and incentivise people to work. I fundamentally believe that we should want people to invest for the future. I fundamentally believe we should want the self-starters of this country to back themselves, show energy, spirit and enterprise so they can get ahead. I fundamentally believe in a better future where we're working cooperatively together to build out the promise of this country, not simply to turn around and, as the government likes to do, make good, honest, decent people who are seeking to put their effort to work, whether it's Capital or Labor, as the villain so that they can raid their tax, their income and their tax.
Okay.
Ruben Spargo from Sky News.
Thank you. Mr Wilson, according to the Sky News Pulse poll today, voters are backing Pauline Hanson and Barnaby Joyce over you and Angus Taylor.
It's personally about me, is it? I'm cheeky.
One Nation, it's understood, is set to announce a policy on gas tomorrow while you've been building a website. Are you doing enough to secure Conservative votes here?
I think it's a little bit trivial to say, hey, we're going to engage the entire small business community of the country and not provide a pathway for them to do so. So I'll take the opportunity, thank you, for if anybody wants to engage in how to back the self-starters of the country and build a pathway, one, to fight against Labor's new taxes, you should go to notthetax.com.au. And of course, if you want to be part of our consultation about how we're going to build a better future of this country, to go through standwithsmall.org. Because actually, one of the things the government has done right now, and not by my words, but by the Prime Minister's words, is he has betrayed the trust of the Australian community. Before the election, he said 50 times over he wouldn't introduce the taxes that he did in the budget. I couldn't say that. He has said that. And one of the problems with when you do that is you corrode the trust in the political system, so much so that the very thick walls in the building a few 100 metres up the road feel slightly more hollow, certainly to a lot of Australian people, the Australian people who feel that they now lack a certain level of integrity. I think one of the big challenges for all of us in the 21st century is building a political system that engages with people where they have a pathway to have a conversation and to be a participant in it. Because that's the pathway, not just that you can then get people's input and views, but in addition to that, you can then go on and develop policy that actually works for them. The government has a very different view. Their view is to tear down the trust that they had, that they were gifted to them by the Australian people, and to abuse that trust. And the consequence of that is, of course, now manifest in the problems that they have with their polling. I've said many times before, including I think it was on David Spear's program relatively recently, and probably Tom's too, that we have a big job to do. But the pathway to make sure we rebuild a confident Australia where people want to back a Liberal vision is that they feel empowered and that they feel and are living that we are fighting for them enough that because they believe that what we are offering forward is going to fight for them. And so I believe whatever the Orange Paddock of Despair wants to do is up to them, because I don't believe they have a vision or a purpose for this country. But yes, we absolutely have more work to do, and we'll proudly keep doing it.
Mark Riley from the Seven Network.
Thank you, Tom. Mr Wilson, just on your observation there about a betrayal of trust and the breach of promise, Matt Canavan, the leader of your coalition partner, has said today that the tax changes are so profound that people were misled in such a large way that that should be put back to the people. He's calling for an election on this issue.
Sure.
I'm just wondering, with the coalition's polling at historical lows, whether you share your coalition partner's political death wish.
Cute.
Well, pretty accurate.
I've been in plenty of elections where they've started, they've finished in a different place. I think you've been in a few too as well, Mark, and you've witnessed a few along the way. So I don't believe anything is predetermined. I believe that going to the next election, we need to be again, I'll go back, I've said this many times before, the most bold, confident Liberals with the clearest vision about where we want to take the country, and more importantly, to clarify for Australians not just what we are fighting for, but who we are fighting for. And I've outlined today very clearly that we are here to back the self-starters of this country to get ahead. So, Matt's right. The Prime Minister has utterly betrayed the Australian community. The policies he took to the last election are not the ones he is seeking to implement now. If he had any guts or courage, he would do so, but he won't. The question is the fate of the Treasurer, because he has now become the albatross that's hanging around the Prime Minister's neck.
Election would be good? So yes to an election?
I haven't called for an election, but I have made the point that there is a very clear breach of trust. I have never been afraid of elections, but I am not suggesting that that's the case. Matt has made those statements, but I'm focused on making sure that we hold the government to account, that we stop the changes in the taxes they've put forward, which breach the trust of the Australian people, and more importantly, if necessary, we'll repeal them.
Jessica Wang from Daily Telegraph.
Jessica.
Thanks, Mr Wilson. Given that you've repeatedly criticised the government for its inflationary spending, how do you, as the Shadow Treasurer, justify committing to both the WATO and the index tax brackets, as Angus Taylor has? And on budget discipline, will the Coalition go into the next election with a spending cap measured by government spending to GDP?
So on the first question, the reason we can justify it is because inflation is ultimately about aggregate spending. As I always say to people in the media, I could save $15 billion by making sure we get back the money that's been stolen by the CFMEU Labor cartel through to organised crime, by making sure we cut down and crack down on the corruption fraud that exists in the NDIS. The government has created honeypots that have been raided of honest Australian taxpayers' money that is now being used, and it is just as inflationary as any other dollar out there in the economy. And we will absolutely have more offsets in the lead up to the election because at the end of the day, our view about where money should go is empowering and the hip pockets of Australians, because that's where we believe it best to be, not by borrowing from the future to feed inflation today, as the current government insists on doing. And in addition to that, their willingness to allow public money to go to dishonest ends.
Can I just follow up on that? You said you'd have more offsets in the lead up to the election. Is that a confirmation of more tax offsets?
No, I'm talking about more spending offsets.
Cool. Thank you.
Spending cuts?
Well, there'll be offsets, meaning there will be, yes, cuts, because there will be different parts of the program, of programs that the government is wasting money on. As I said, the government is trying to desperately cut their own budget right now in different parts because they have created these honeypots, particularly in public programs, that are going to fraud, waste and corruption. They've been dragged there kicking and screaming to make sure that public money is used to appropriate purposes. We want to rebalance the budget back in favour of Australians, away from fraud and organised crime.
Patrick Commons from The Guardian.
Thanks very much, Tim. My question is around the CGT and the negative gearing changes in the budget. I think you're making the argument that there's a perverse effect here, and it's actually going to make it harder for young Australians to get into the housing market because they won't have access to those benefits. And if that's right, do you then think that the status quo that's existed for the last 25 years or so around the CGT discount and around negative gearing has actually helped young Australians get into the housing market?
Well, the housing market predominantly is one that's reflected on the challenges of supply and demand. We know that. But absolutely, as people need flexibility, we're seeing huge numbers of people pursuing things like rent vesting if they can't secure what they want where they want, and they're looking at different options to be able to do so. The key thing we need to actually do is keep encouraging housing stock to be built. As Angus Taylor correctly outlines, if you tax something, you tend to get less of it. Except in one example, of course, which is the volume of tax we've applied to tobacco, which has led to organised crime profiteering, and the government simply refuses to swallow its pride and have a proper conversation about that. So we need to make sure that young Australians can get ahead, and they're doing it right now. The number of young Australians who've contacted me in the past week who have invested their home deposit, and never forget this, the technology has changed around how people save and invest their money in a way that simply did not exist when I was growing up. When I was growing up, shares were the domain of the rich. You needed to go through a broker. It was expensive to do transactions. Of course, the available information in the public domain was also very scarce. By comparison now, information is transparent. It is cheap to be able to do transactions. And of course, you can use different platforms to buy shares, ETFs, crypto, and that is what young Australians are doing. And they are just as much going to be hit by these CGT changes as anybody else. And as a consequence, they're finding their first home deposit is being pushed backwards.
Tobacco tax is sort of perfect, isn't it? Because we've got a lot less legal tobacco after it went up. Melissa Code from The Mandarin.
Well, legal as well as we now have We've essentially abolished plain packaging through the process of what the government has done, and of course it has led to distribution systems of organised crime profiteering across the board. It's just the most maddening situation.
A lot of increases under the coalition. I didn't mean to jump in though. So.
That's right.
Melissa Code.
Hi, Mr. Wilson. Thank
Hello.
you for your talk. When I listen to the discourse, particularly among sort of average pundits about what the budget means for them and how it affects them, there is a strong sentiment on either side, all extremes, that the status quo is broken and that everyone's working their guts out and not seeing the benefit of that, not seeing their standard of living improve in the way that they did generations past.
Yes.
But when I listen to your speech, and I want to put this question because it's what I hear and I'm sure it's not what you mean, I hear you talking about getting ahead and self-starters and that these people are the engine of the national economy and they are the beacon of hope for growth. There's a real sort of us and them divide wherever you look when people talk about the budget. So my question is, in your mind, who in Australia is entitled to aspiration and hope? Is it just the self-starters or is it also the workers? And is the coalition making a pitch for all of Australia or just that discrete section of the community?
It absolutely includes every single Australian, and we should be setting our eyes to the horizon about saying Australians should be a self-starter nation. And I make that point very clearly because one of the things, and again, going and talking to young Australians as we have over the past weeks, specifically post the budget, what a lot of them have said to us is, my staff now have side hustles. They have a salary, but they also have something else. They might be having investments through sweat equity in shared equity schemes for other activities they're up to. So there is no us and them. It is all about empowerment and how we lift people up and encourage them to look to the horizon with hope. The biggest problem is this government simply does not understand how Australians are working today, how they're investing today, how they're shifting the practice of their economic activity, changing and adapting to the technological change and the needs to meet the market. So it's not an us or them, it's quite the reverse. It's about empowerment of every single Australian.
But your message is fundamentally that's the new normal.
That's what people are living, and I respect how people live their lives. I'd like to stop Jim Chalmers' active inflation agenda. I'd like to see the government stop borrowing from tomorrow to feed today and the problems around inflation and how that's corroding people's wealth and income. I'd like to see lots of things change, but even if that doesn't change, and even if it does, I still believe that this country's best future is when Australians are backing themselves, when they're looking at different pathways, because that gives people flexibility, it gives them a sense of agency and control over their own lives, it puts them in a position best where they can grow their wealth. In years past, the world was a different place. I'm the first to acknowledge that. I'm looking at the type of economy we should want to build that empowers Australians.
Thanks.
Naveen Razik from SBS.
Thanks, Mr. Wilson. You spoke in your speech about the importance of the fair go in Australia. Mm-hmm. What's fair for new permanent migrants or permanent residents coming to Australia who pay the same level of tax, being denied access to government services like the NDIS and parental leave pay?
Well, the welfare system isn't solely there to make sure that it provides anybody who's here benefits. Not everybody ultimately pays taxes in the way that we might like, but that's not to marginalise any section of the community. It's just an acknowledgement that that's what happens. The objective of the Australian project and Australian public services primarily to benefit Australian citizens. We, of course, have included grandfathering measures in our proposals. We've excluded things like health and education. But let's be clear about this. If you want a nation of a fair go, I don't believe that we are setting new Australians up for success if we're saying the solution to your problems or your challenges is to become welfare dependent. I believe that new Australians are best served when they are encouraged to work, and I absolutely believe they want to, that they seek to take control of their own lives and contribute, and they want to, because the expectation for them and for us should be to come, to commit and to contribute to a better future for yourselves, to a better future for the rest of us, and a better shared journey for all Australians.
But what happens if someone gets a disability out of unforeseen circumstances or, with parental leave, has to carry a child and may not have that covered by the government?
Well, we as you know, we have different arrangements, different insurance schemes that exist already in the private market. There are different types of state-based schemes as well, depending on the specific conditions. So we need to make sure the system is working for Australians to maintain confidence in it, because Milton Friedman, some of us still like Milton Friedman, always made the point that one of the things that will undermine a migration system is a welfare system that's seen to be deemed to be too generous, and that over time it will corrode the confidence that people have.
Thanks, Mr Wilson.
Given you missed out on an address in your last term in office, happy to squeeze in a couple more for us?
Well, we're still going with live broadcast. I don't know whether we're still on.
I believe we are. All right. It'll be in a newspaper, info or not. Finn McHugh from the Capital Brief.
Hey, Tim, you tried to get it in before, but I just wanted you to expand on the tobacco excise. It's not just a health issue, it's a crime issue and a major economic one now. Do you think we're repeating the mistakes of the Prohibition American era, and how would the Coalition address it?
So the short answer is, over summer I actually read a book on the history of Prohibition, and spoiler alert, we are. And there are multiple dimensions to why it is to do with structure of government and the consequences associated with it. The truth is, the system is now so bad, and it is bad. I mean, we basically have marginal amount of legal products sold. We have huge loss of tax revenue, which is just but one component of it. I would be shocked and amazed if it's not having a bigger impact on the overall consumption of the product. And as I said before, it fundamentally turns lawful citizens into engaging in unlawful product and unlawful behaviour. But the challenge for me is I don't know what tax rate you would have to now reduce it to actually change the system. The distribution networks are set up. We're now seeing them replicated in illicit alcohol. And the big question for everybody is, what would you need to cut excise, and whether there's a political will to do it, to actually get people to prop up and pack up, sorry, I should say, and move out. I've heard numbers like 30%. My personal view is I remain sceptical that that's enough. And so this needs a multi-pronged approach. I have heard from some retailers who have come and seen me recently about different strategies about how you could address with it, particularly around the burdens and obligations around landlords. But I think we're going to have to be very creative to unpack a problem that was created by government and has led to turning, as I said, honest citizens into engaging in dishonest activity.
We are still live, I'm assured. We'll end things with John Keogh from the AFR.
Afternoon, Shadow Treasurer. You've committed to income tax indexation, which will cost the budget revenue in the tune of more than $200 billion over a decade. The Coalition wants to increase defence spending from 2% to 3% of GDP. That's about $30 billion a year. And you've committed to wind back Labor's tax increases on trust capital gains and negative gearing, which the Treasurer tells us are worth more than $80 billion over a decade. Are we now in a situation, as Michael Brennan, the former Productivity Commissioner Chairman, suggests, where the Liberals are like the Republicans in the United States, where they want to cut taxes but they won't cut spending, and so we still have big budget deficits and debt, and Labor is like the Democrats, where they spend and don't balance the budget either? I mean, realistically, on those numbers I presented, you're no chance of balancing the budget, reducing debt or deficits, are you?
Well, I don't agree with your analysis at all. Though I always respect Michael Brennan and his contributions as well. And to you, John, as well. But no, I don't agree with it, because we absolutely need to make sure that we have a sustainable budget. And there are one of the cheap party tricks of the Labor Party is to say in Parliament, well, what is it you would cut? And then they go through the fraud, the corruption and the misuse of public money and happily say, yes, we will get rid of the fraud and corruption that exists. The big challenge we have is I do not know the situation we are going to inherit at the end of this term. But it's absolutely my objective to make sure that we have a sustainable budget that is focused very clearly on constraining public spending and looking at how we reprioritise spending to make sure that we get maximum value for buck for the Australian taxpayer. I spoke before about how we could reprioritise public money in the context of technology and AI. This is coming. It's going to be in the private sector, it's going to be in the public sector too, and the world we're going to inherit will probably be quite different from where we are now. But I'm afraid some of us still believe that before we turn around to the Australian people and pull their belt in, we should pull our belt in too.
Now, we're only 2 years from an election, maybe sooner if Matt Canavan gets his way. So never too soon to ask. You come back here at the Press Club and debate Jim Chalmers before the next election?
Well, so far I understand that every time there's been a conversation about whether we debate or not, he has declined the invitation. So
you can be out there, go, I'm ready, where's Jim?
Yeah, but I think I've kind of done that today.
All right. Tim Wilson, we appreciate your time. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank the Shadow Treasurer.